I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is episode number 89 of the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your brain by any and all means at your disposal. This week we're going to be talking about something that sounds a heck of a lot like a drug when you hear about the effects, but it turns out it is anything but. This is an episode about a practice called Holotropic Breathwork, which I just heard about fairly recently, and it caught my attention. It sounds extremely bizarre at face value, but we've got an expert coming on to talk about it. His name is Dr. James Eyerman, and the elevator pitch for what holotropic breathwork is essentially a breathing technique that can induce psychedelic-like experiences, complete hallucinations, really unique and profound mental states that there's no way, I guess, a person would confuse with their everyday waking reality, all just by breathing a certain way. So a very interesting topic. That'll be in the main interview. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, I'm going to tell you a trick that I just used to reestablish myself on the West Coast time zone after a 14-hour time difference on a flight that I just took this past weekend. The technique worked just swell, and I will share what that is in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick at the end of the episode. But let's get things going with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts. This Week in Neuroscience.
So, concussions. We do not like concussions. We are against concussions as a matter of policy here at Smart Drug Smarts. However, concussions happen more than we'd like, and oftentimes more than we even know about. There are 3 grades to concussion, grades 1, 2, and 3, and only the 3rd grade of concussion is serious enough where people can immediately tell that something's wrong. When you're lying on your back, you've just been sacked, you're on the football field of play, and the coach is over you asking if you remember your name and moving his finger in front of you and asking you to follow his finger with your eyes, and you're trying to do that. It's only grade 3 concussions that are serious enough that you might not be able to actually perform those tasks. But that doesn't mean that in the first 2 grades of concussion that there hasn't been some structural damage done to the brain, and in fact there has. But because we don't have pain receptors, for example, on the inside of our skulls, and because the behavioral results of a concussion, one of these lower grade concussions, aren't there to be seen, people can get whacks on the head and have structural brain damage, which will eventually heal given the time, but they might not know about it. And the scary thing is that once you've had one of these minor concussions, your brain is then more susceptible to secondary whacks on the head. So if you're going back into the football game, for example, you're actually at a much greater position of danger than you were prior to the first small concussion. So it would be nice to know, if we had an easy way of doing so, whether these grade 1 or 2 concussions have in fact taken place. So researchers at the Utah State University's Brain Imaging Laboratory for something called LEAP, that's the Learning, Education, and Auditory Processing acronym. It's such a long name, I'm not even sure how to pronounce it. Anyway, they have been working on a way of identifying whether these low-grade concussions have taken place. They're using something called functional near-infrared spectroscopy, and what they found, kind of interestingly, is that when a small concussion has taken place, there's actually quite a bit more activity in the concussion-affected area of the brain. Now, normally when we think of brain activity and being high levels of brain activity, we're like, oh, there's a lot of thinking going on there. That sounds like a good thing, right? But in the case of concussion, no, it's not really. What happens actually is that there's an equal amount of thinking going on in these brain regions following a minor concussion, but a whole lot more effort is being expended to kind of get the same cognitive processes accomplished. So if you think of a busy city with a lot of different streets, and some of them are the major thoroughfares with 10-lane highways with a lot of people traveling, and those are the roads everybody knows, and then there's other small streets that are side streets that maybe the local people know, but not everybody else. They don't get used nearly as much. When a concussion happens, it causes something called micro tears in the brain's normal communication channels. And the brain's got this giant amount of redundancy in its network, so there could still be ways of getting the information that needs to travel across the brain traveling, but it's as if all the cars on these major highways and thoroughfares in the city suddenly need to start taking these surface streets that they might not know as well. The streets aren't as wide, there's strange traffic patterns and things get backed up, and basically communication can still happen, but it just happens with a whole lot more effort and honking horns and people waving their fists out windows and things of that nature. So in the context of the brain, what we see this as is more glucose being burned and basically a whole lot more effort being put out physiologically for the same amount of thought process to happen. The researchers found that in these low-grade concussions, people don't necessarily perform worse as far as reaction speeds or correct answers on tests and things like that. But again, the real danger in these low-grade concussion cases is just putting a brain back into a situation where it could be harmed secondarily, and that secondary injury could be quite a bit worse. So will functional near-infrared spectroscopy machines be sitting on football or soccer sidelines anytime soon? That I don't know, but it's definitely interesting research and seems like an important discovery. So thank you to everybody that reached out this week and made contact. We had last week's episode, the self-experiment where I did Ritalin for the first time. Drew a lot of comments, probably drew a lot of raised eyebrows. One longtime listener of the podcast came forward and offered to lend his expertise on a similar episode about Adderall. He said he's a prescribed Adderall user, but had really had a hard time kind of knowing what to expect from the drug, if it was doing what it was supposed to, and that it's a drug that had so much stigma around it. He had a difficult time sort of knowing what to expect and knowing who to talk to about it, and that a resource similar to the episode that we did last week on methylphenidate would have been handy for him had he discovered something similar for Adderall when he'd first been using it. So we'll probably get that together in the near future. I think that sounds like a pretty swell idea. So if you're listening and you have an Adderall story that you wish to share, definitely feel free to reach out. My email is Jesse, that's Jesse, at smartdrugsmarts.com. Drop me an email or tweet at us, that's at smartdrugsmarts. And we'll get a little list of people put together to reach out to when we're putting an episode like that together in the not terribly distant future. I also heard from a friend of mine in academia. So last week we talked about the mathematician Paul Erdős. I believe I mispronounced that one a bit in the last episode, which shouldn't come as a surprise. But apparently there's something called an Erdős number in math. And my friend said that he had an Erdős number of 1. And so I said to him, well, congratulations. What's an Erdős number? And apparently, okay, so you're probably familiar with the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. That idea that Kevin Bacon's been in so many different movies with so many different people that pretty much any working actor or any actor that's ever done anything, you can kind of connect them by a chain of other actors to Kevin Bacon. Kevin Bacon acted in this movie with such and such. That person acted in another movie with so-and-so. And so as an actor, you might have a Kevin Bacon number of 2 or a Kevin Bacon number of 3. Well, apparently mathematicians have the same thing with Paul Erdős. He traveled around so much, worked with so many different mathematicians over the course of his long career that it kind of became a running joke. And if you published a paper with Paul Erdős, you had an Erdős number of 0. So anyway, my friend published a paper with somebody who had published a paper previously with Paul Erdős, so he has a Erdős number of 1. I figured that was a pretty neat little piece of academic trivia. So if somebody drops an Erdős number on you, you can now nod knowingly and know exactly what they're talking about and maybe offer them some amphetamines in honor of Paul Erdős. There's been a great deal of writing going on behind the scenes at Smart Drug Smarts, most of it not yet published, but one of the things that was published this week was a new page at smartdrugsmarts.com/write4us with hyphens between the words write for and us. But if you've got an article that you think would be a Smart Drug Smarts appropriate topic and you would like to submit that for publication, definitely feel free. We've got our writer's guidelines, such as they are, up on that page. And yeah, I know there's a ton of interesting opinions, interesting people doing interesting things out in the listenership, so if you're one of them and you'd like to share, definitely don't be shy about submitting something. If you're not so much the writing type, but you are the reading type, and you want to be kept up to date on everything that we've got going on at Smart Drug Smarts, I enthusiastically encourage you to sign up for our mailing list. The email sign-up can be found, not surprisingly, at smartdrugsmarts.com, or you can text SDS for Smart Drug Smarts to the phone number 33733 and follow a very short yellow brick road and you will be all signed up. I would like to throw another big overt thank you to everybody that's tried out the Nexus and Mitogen supplement stacks that we recently opened under the brand Axon Labs. It's been excellent to see the orders coming in. Really appreciate the people that are trying that out. And of course, extremely happy to hear positive feedback coming back. If you're one of the early purchasers and you've been using Nexus and or Mitogen for a while now, enough to feel like you kind of got the feel for it, and you would be willing to leave a testimonial with your experience, that would be super awesome. We've probably about time to rotate out those initial testimonials that we've had on the front page of axonlabs.io for a while now and kind of have a little bit of a rotating cast of characters. That would be pretty awesome. So yeah, just reach out to me if you have any interest in that. Jesse at smartdrugsmarts.com, and not surprisingly, also Jesse at axonlabs.io. I love hearing from people. I do read my own email, and on a long enough timeline, I pretty much answer all the emails. There's probably a couple of them that have been waiting in my in-basket for a while, but emails in the bottom of my inbox, they age like fine wine. It's when I finally get down to them, I feel so guilty for having let them linger that I tend to write more, actually. But okay, enough of that. Let's move on.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So, okay, we're going to be talking with Dr. James Eyerman. He is the director of the Marin Transpersonal Institute in Northern California and an associate professor of clinical psychiatry at both Touro University and the University of California at San Francisco. He and I talked for a long time. This is actually quite a cut-down version of the conversation we had, which went for over an hour. But part of the reason for that cutting is because I'm actually planning on salvaging a lot of the things that didn't make it into this episode for a future episode, which will be more of a self-experiment episode where I actually try the holotropic breathwork that we're going to be learning about in this interview. So again, what is holotropic breathwork? We're going to get the definition in the interview, but essentially it's a system for hyperventilating with a goal in mind, with a cognitive goal in mind of putting yourself into a very unique psychedelic state. Now, one of the things that you'll notice in this interview is that there's a lot of reference to, I guess, what you would consider like the lexicon of psychedelics. When people are talking analytically about psychedelic drugs and psychedelic experiences, as with any other domain specialty, there's kind of a jargon built around that. So pieces of that jargon are going to get dropped in this conversation, which you might not be familiar with. I wasn't familiar with, but you can pretty much pick up the context of what he's talking about. The most interesting one I thought was the terminology crunchy, which I've always thought of as a description for things like peanut butter, but is used quite a bit differently here. Anyway, this is a really interesting topic. I haven't tried this myself yet. I certainly plan to in the very near future. Oh, the one thing that didn't make it into this cut of the interview, but is worth pointing out, I think this is probably pretty clearly implied, but this is a state that is entered typically with somebody lying on their back. You don't go into a holotropic breathwork session standing or sitting up. So should you do the play-at-home game version of this and try it yourself, definitely bear that in mind. But to start off with sort of a ground-level explanation of what holotropic breathwork is, let's jump in with Dr. James Eyerman.
The interesting thing about holotropic breathwork is that its experience is similar to psychedelics. This term, holotropic, is sort of a fancy term developed by Stanislav Grof, who was a major LSD researcher. And he's from Czechoslovakia. He's sort of an Eastern European intellectual. And he came up with this Greek word, holo, meaning, wholeness, and tropic meaning turning towards. So it has to do with turning towards wholeness or inner experiences of unity. And he contrasts that with the term hylotropic, which is sort of outer-directed consciousness, hylo meaning other, and tropic meaning turning towards otherness, or the world of multiplicity. So holotropic is sort of an inward-directed experience, which allows access to unitive states like ecstatic states or expanded consciousness states, transpersonal states, collective consciousness types of things, versus outer-directed sensory experience, which takes us into all the myriad details of the worldly objective experience. So holotropic is basically an inner journey. Holotropic breathwork is the type of breathwork that allows you to journey into your psyche.
Before we talk about how one would actually get into the state, kind of the mechanisms of it, what are the reasons that somebody would be into this? If somebody were to do holotropic breathwork, what would they be attempting to accomplish?
There are many reasons people do inner journeys. Sometimes it's for self-healing. So people are in different states and they reflect. I might feel that I've got some conflict or some confusion going on, and so I spend some time searching inside myself, sort of consciously seeing what comes up emotionally. I think we all do that periodically, or putting experiences together from the past. What does this resonate with? And using psychological techniques. There are various psychological techniques for doing this type of thing. Psychedelics and entheogens were discovered in the West, sort of in the post-World War II era, even though the Native Americans and the Aborigines and South America have been doing this for thousands of years. Started being used sort of scientifically and psychiatrically back in the 50s. And Grof was one of the major researchers. Actually, there are about 1,000 research studies using LSD as a therapy in the 50s and 60s until it was outlawed. And they found it was very beneficial for people with disorders that were pretty much untreatable, like alcoholism, etc. One LSD experience would often help people into recovery quite dramatically. There are about 1,000 papers that were very positive on LSD from the medical psychiatric point of view. So that's one reason to do it. Another reason is that it actually provides knowledge that is uncanny, so to speak, that's not from the ordinary world. So, Carlos Castaneda's idea of a non-ordinary reality is another way of looking at this, or spiritual journeying, so that shamans and wise men and perhaps Native Americans routinely would go out and do some type of fasting or ritual initiation in order to discover who they were. They'd get their name by what happened during these events, and what their purpose in life was, and what their destiny was. And so it's been used for many millennia. Apparently the Bushmen of Africa, the San people, have been using this and have rock drawings going back 80,000 years, maybe 120,000 years. So probably as long as Homo sapiens have been around in our present genetic form, we've been using some kind of altered state to connect with the world, to learn what it's all about, and to discover stuff about ourselves and what to do next. So primates produce DMT. And whether or not that's actually involved in holotropic breathwork, nobody knows. And whether the pineal gland is actually the only thing you need to produce DMT and psychedelic experiences. But the holotropic breathwork psychedelic experiences occur similar to DMT in that you're in and out of them like in an instant. You're breathing along and all of a sudden you're gone and you become a whale or a bird or some solar system or a goddess or a demon or whatever. And then you're back.
You said that very blasely, as if that I've never turned into any of those things. That seems like quite an experience to me. So you're going through this system of breathing, and literally you can just drop into a full body hallucination.
Completely. And it doesn't matter whether you're sort of oriented to this type of experience or not. I've had 14-year-olds, 16-year-olds have these experiences who had no clue that this is what they're going to get into. I mean, the first patient I ever did holotropic breathwork with was a 14-year-old who re-experienced the night he committed suicide and then successfully completed it during the breathwork and became the universe. Yeah, I didn't trust it. I kept him in the hospital and rebreathed him the next week. And that time he went directly into being the universe. Then he said he became pure consciousness. Then he became the universe and pure consciousness together. And, that's written about in the Rig Veda and Buddhist texts, and it's a big deal in the non-duality circles and all that sort of stuff. And here's a 14-year-old who has no previous experience, did not know anything about philosophy or psychology, had no spiritual background, and he basically had an experience that would have blown a lot of dedicated Buddhist monks, Zen monks, out of the water. These breathing techniques actually will alter the consciousness to such a degree that you can go places in an altered state. Generally with eyes closed, but sometimes even with eyes open.
Let's talk about what the vanilla variety session would be like. You mentioned that this is a 3-hour endeavor. What's going on during those 3 hours?
With holotropic breathwork, you start off with a little bit of orientation. We give the graph map, so you create a mental set that sort of allows various experiences, either from your childhood or intrauterine experiences or whatever, or altered state sensory experiences, to the whole idea that you might have some type of collective unconscious experience or transpersonal experience, spiritual experience. And a little bit of prep of orientation, because it does make a difference about whether you allow stuff to happen or not, and you don't think you're going nuts, in other words. So first you create a mindset that allows people to have the experiences, since our cultural mindset doesn't say these are okay. Second of all, you get rid of some superficial tension by doing a little bit of relaxation, either progressive muscle relaxation or some type of other guided relaxation. Then the session starts off generally with driving music, so that it sort of facilitates the idea of picking up the breath and breathing harder and faster. And the music has no English words or no words in the language that if you're French or German, no words in those languages. It can be movie theme music, it can be ethnic music, it can be symphonic music, and or folk music, actually, driving folk music. So it goes off with driving music to get the breathing going, help you facilitate the breathing and get energized, so to speak. And then it'll go into a little more emotionally challenging music to help you sort of access emotional material or open up emotionally. So as opposed to just driving music, which can be more like a rock concert, you have something that has a little more emotional theme to it. It also may be driving, but it can also float in and out of sort of more sensitive emotional spaces, heart spaces. Whatever it means to one person might be totally different to the other person. So it goes sort of driving music, then more emotional music, and then more tranquil music, to sort of come down from this roller coaster ride where you sort of climaxed emotionally and you come down. It helps facilitate access to inner experiences and to emotional experiences, and seems also to help access altered states. I've done about 11,000 inpatients at over about a 12-year period of time, 20 patients every week for 12 years at an inpatient facility in St. Louis with the help of 4 music therapists. And people had sort of the standard grade, having a flying experience or a swimming experience and being a different animal, or having an experience of bright light or an angel or something like that. But also stuff that I'd never heard of before, being some kind of creature from another universe. I mean, it's all kinds of stuff. just about as great a range of experiences as you can imagine in sci-fi. Tales from the weird and unknown occur. And so people have experiences of being transformer machines where they become a car and they turn into a robot or they turn into a crane or they turn into a plane. I mean, all kinds of experiences. I scratch my head and often my jaw's on the floor and it's like, well, this is fascinating. So I think it's a very rich field of experience, and how it relates to what's going on in your life at the time is sometimes open to interpretation. We don't interpret it. We just leave it open to the individual to research it themselves and decide what it means. Back in the day before the internet, I might have guided people to, like, one social worker came for a breath work because she heard it was some of the patients had good experiences, and she says, is it like biofeedback? I said, yeah, you get a pretty relaxed state, and you get into some altered states, expanded consciousness like biofeedback. And she had this experience. She said, this isn't anything like biofeedback. She said, what happened? She said, well, I was doing this breathing, and all of a sudden I got hit like by lightning in my tailbone. It went up my spine and came out my heart, and I turned into a frog. I was sitting at a bonfire at night with a bunch of other frogs with a frog god. She says, what is that? I said, well, I have no idea, but you might want to read about the Northwest American Indians. They have a lot of this frog god stuff. We used to direct people towards that, but now with the internet, you can look up the experiences.
From what I understand, you're breathing heavily, you're breathing at an accelerated rate. What are the kind of details there? How long, how many minutes does it take for somebody generally to drop into one of these psychedelic states? Is the breathing like a throttle where you can kind of back off on it if you feel like you've gone somewhere too scary? How do some of these mechanisms work?
Well, that's an excellent question, and there aren't excellent answers. One point you brought up is it is like a throttle, which is one nice part about this as opposed to psychedelics. You enter into the altered state and you're not feeling particularly comfortable. You can come out of it pretty much at will. And we generally suggest this is not done alone because you can get into pretty crunchy spaces. The universe's psychology is filled with crunchy spaces. And you might want somebody to assist you through these experiences when they get into some unknown territory that you have no idea how to negotiate. What the mechanism of action is it really needs to be researched. I actually wrote a paper about models of mechanism of action because one thing we used to think is, we hyperventilate, so we must be blowing off carbon dioxide and hyperoxygenating ourselves. Well, we do blow off carbon dioxide, but we don't hyperoxygenate ourselves unless you have some type of lung disease. The oxygen saturation of blood stays pretty much the same. Blowing off the carbon dioxide really doesn't make any difference in terms of the physiology of the blood because the kidneys compensate for blowing off CO2. So the kidneys will bring back bicarbonate, and the blood's too well buffered to get much of a pH change. So the whole idea that in panic attacks people have hyperventilation syndrome or carpal pedal spasm is not due to altered pH. It's probably due to something else. And that's been known since the late 90s. And so what is this alteration in consciousness that either produces carpal pedal spasm and numbness and stiffness and cramping in the arms and legs, and or altered states where you actually trip out? And the yogis have talked about the vagus nerve for decades or centuries, actually probably since the 1900s. In the West, we thought it was all from the brain to the gut and the heart and the lungs and stuff. Well, now we know 80% of it goes back to the brain from the heart and lungs and skin and tympanic membrane and whatever. And the more they study the vagus nerve, they discover the various inputs are broader than we ever thought. And one theory is that, this is the old yogic theory, is that you actually tone the vagus nerve by the breathing. So you actually, by rhythmically breathing, with your pelvic diaphragm, you move the vagus nerve up and down in the pelvic diaphragm and send signals back to the brain, which alters the way the brain works. There's also the idea that there are stretch receptors in the chest, and when you breathe deeply, and you stretch those, they send signals back again through the parasympathetic nervous system, similar to the vagus nerve, up into the brainstem. And there are three major nuclei that alter the way the brain works as well. So there are at least two different distinct mechanisms from just the physical part of hyperventilating. And so that's sort of from the Western physiological point of view. Traditionally, psyche is the Greek word for breath. So it seems like even in ancient Greece, they had the idea that breath and psyche were connected. And if you altered the breath, you altered the psyche. And chanting and various rhythmic breathing things have been used for millennia, not just by the Greeks or the Romans. Spiritus, also meaning breath, and inspiration and expiration altered your spirit. And actually, when you died, your breath left you, right?
Yeah, I remember reading that about ancient Greek, that they didn't have a distinction between ceasing to breathe and ceasing to live.
Right, and so they saw the soul or the psyche as being the breath. So this is a different model. It's not really biomechanical anymore. We're now talking about something a little more holistic and a little more on the paleoethnic level. And the whole idea that breath is involved with some type of experience of a spiritual import has been around for a long, long time. Not just in the yogic tradition, not just in the Greek and Roman tradition, but in an Aboriginal tradition dating back tens of thousands of years, which gives me goosebumps. It may seem hard to believe if you haven't done breath work, but you can see how a little bit of rhythmic drumming, chanting, breathing, or dancing can lead into sort of trance mystical states. And that you can then have experiences from any place and any time.
Let me actually go back to something you said. You mentioned 11,000 different patients or people that you'd worked with using these techniques over the years. That's a giant number, and certainly enough to see some trends and things like that. If you had to characterize the people that did this and really liked it, and the people that were kind of so-so on it, they're like, yeah, that was interesting, but it's nothing that I ever feel the need to do it again, or people that had overtly negative reactions and didn't like it, didn't want to ever step back in those waters again, how would you characterize sort of the differences in those groups of people?
Well, I think certainly all those experiences occur. Everybody doesn't think this is wonderful stuff. And one of the purposes of doing it is sort of to go through, and ritual initiations is thought of as a death rebirth. So that in Aboriginal cultures, you would go from being a child into being an adult, but generally it's a relatively rigorous experience. It's not like the current bar mitzvahs or confirmations or something. It's like really a death of the child and being reborn as a totally different creature as an adult, where you take a different role in the tribe and you adopt different languages and different views of the world. And that can be pretty scary. Having some support through that and having some understanding that might happen and being willing to let that happen is part of the reason why it's good to have a format ahead of time that this could happen. That you may actually go through a total trip to the underworld and back again, like Persephone, so a trip to Hades and back. But there's a renewal involved, a new springtime, a new you coming, so to speak. And that the conditioned self, the ego that you think you are, that you sort of got your thoughts and your habits from either your family, or your friends, or your society, is not who you are entirely. It's just one aspect. It's sort of like the tools you picked up to lead your life, but you're somehow a much deeper being, a much different animal than who you think you are. And you can discover that. And that can be a little bit frightening, letting go of your identity. 82% of these inpatients who had experiences, they had transpersonal experiences which were right out of Groff's LSD stuff. And they voted it the best therapy in the hospital. Now, what difference did that make to them in the long run? We don't know, because we didn't have the follow-ups except for a few of them. So it sort of opened them up. As the psychologists at the hospital said, we don't know what you do on Tuesday night, but on Wednesday morning everybody talks. So it gave them much greater access to their psyche, both emotionally and apparently articulately. People, when they do breath work, they may go through some tough stuff, which they don't expect. I've done probably hundreds of breath works, and some of my scariest breath works were, after the 60th breath work or whatever, when I totally freaked out, and I was really glad I had the music therapist there to help me out type of stuff. It helps to have a support group that will help you integrate it and give some idea that, it's okay to have had this kind of challenging experience. And actually only 2% of the individuals had no experience. And of those, they weren't necessarily enchanted with it. However, it may be that they also had something called satori, or a Zen moment, where they actually had no experience and they just didn't understand it, which also happens. All of a sudden, people's minds sort of settle down, the breath settles down, they stop breathing, they stop thinking, and they're just conscious without content. And that's sort of what Zen's all about. Grof has developed something called focused body work. One thing that he discovered in his LSD studies is that there was a lot of body energy that was associated with LSD experiences and psychedelic experiences, and that body tension had to be resolved in order to get on with things. So during the breath work, people get sort of stuck. And one of the points of the facilitators and the people helping out is to help that body energy come along and resolve itself. And so the idea is that we do a little bit of focused body work to exaggerate the tensions or the energies going on in the body so they break by themselves, sort of go over the hill and down the other side and resolve.
When you say the body gets stuck, break that down. What's that mean?
That means that, you might get some tension in your chest or your gut or your shoulders or your hands, or you just feel totally possessed by rage and you feel it all over your body, or you're totally possessed by fear and you feel all over, and you sort of get stuck in it. It's sort of like you can't get rid of this feeling in your body. So the idea is to move that body energy so it resolves. My 11,000 patients was not a controlled study with 11,000 people not doing it, with just music or whatever, or something alternative like, some type of creative arts therapy as a, quote, placebo, active placebo control. But it's a pretty good indicator that this kind of experience, while it does lead to crunchy places, I mean, Dante's various circles in Inferno are not really pleasant places to be, and you can go there. Those are all human places in your psyche, I mean, if you can relate to them in Dante, you've got it inside of you. You can relate to places in the movie Alien. So you can go to these places, but they resolve. It's very freeing to let go of the ghosts of the past or the spider webs in your mind, the various scorpions that have stung you and are currently stinging you. So if you can free yourself from those, it's like a trip to the beach and just relax,
When somebody comes out of one of these sessions, do you advise that they wait 45 minutes before driving a car again or anything like that? Are there any sort of safety notices?
We recommend they don't play this sort of thematic music on the way home, and that they may want to ground themselves with, we actually generally serve some type of heavy protein or heavy sweet to slow down the energy, to help ground them. We actually, afterwards, have them draw. It's sort of a grounding exercise. I'm more right brain, so non-analytic, to draw the experiences, to help ground the experience in something external. And then they share the experiences, another grounding type of thing. We're back with the group to realize that other people had similar kinds of experiences. Share whatever they want to share. They don't have to share anything they don't want to share, but they hear it. It brings them back into this world a little bit. They may stay open, a little more open for 2 or 3 days. So I recommend they protect themselves, if they're feeling a little vulnerable, a little sensitive, they tell people they have a headache and go take care of themselves. And after 3 days, most people are pretty much have the protective shields back up and they can go back out in society, no problem. But they stay open for a little bit, as a rule. So, it definitely opens some channels. The energy's flowing a little bit more. It can be very bonding. The MDMA studies are basically done on the same model as the holotropic breathwork. It's basically the Grof model, as LSD altered state model. And it's very bonding, and you can find yourself very open, and you can get very close to people. And it's a very rich time in terms of opening the heart, both to your own self and exploring what's going on with yourself, but also with others. Doing the drawings help sort of objectify the experience so you can continue to integrate it over time by just seeing it and sort of bypassing the analytical stuff, and you see the images, and that helps you bring it back into your ordinary life after those 3 or 4 days have passed, and you're sort of back to yourself. Helps integrate some of this material back in, so you can start integrating that other side of yourself into your more culturally conditioned side, or as Angie Eyerman says, you can be a walker in 2 worlds.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much to Dr. James Eyerman for that explanation of all things holotropic breathwork. I think it would be fair to say that my curiosity was incredibly piqued by that conversation. I was alone at the time that I did that interview, and I restrained myself from immediately hanging up the phone, hanging up the Skype conversation, and just trying it out, going straight into a holotropic breathwork session, despite being pretty revved up to give it a try, because it sounded so weird. And on the face of it, it's incredibly difficult for me to believe that. I mean, I do believe it, but how weird that something that's so accessible and that it doesn't require any tools, any drugs, anything other than your breath and some time can put a person into such an altered state. That's just bizarre to me that I hadn't heard about this previously. And yet, as I say this is almost a week after that conversation. I really haven't had a convenient time when I could find somebody to babysit me in case I do this holotropic breathwork self-experiment and, freak out. I'm just not sure what to expect. It sounds like it could be an extremely bizarre situation. I've never turned into a universe or a god of any sort, so far as I know. And so I'm taking the doctor at his word that having the buddy system in place for doing something like this seems like a pretty darn good idea. And I just haven't found that buddy yet to do this. But basically, when I do, which will be in the not terribly distant future, there's going to be certainly a follow-up episode based around it. So we will stay tuned for that. If you have experience with holotropic breathwork, if this is something that you have done, and you want to drop me an email and tell me about your experience, I would absolutely love that. I've reached out to Dr. Eyerman and asked for some of the music that they use for these sessions, if he has any recommendations, and I will put those as links up on the smartdrugsmarts.com website. So come on by, look for the episode number 89 post, and we'll have links up for you there. But now, as promised, the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So I just had a massive plane flight this weekend. I switched 14 hours in time zones, flying all the way across the Pacific, from Southeast Asia to China to California. All in all, door to door, I think it was like a 25-hour odyssey with some motorbikes and taxi cabs and airport layovers along the way. But one of the strange and annoying things about big travel like that, as we know, is the jet lag that comes along with it, having your body be completely discombobulated, not know what time you should be awake, what time you should be asleep. Your circadian rhythms have all gone screwy, and it can take several days to readjust. I think normally it's like 5 to 6 days for most people to get adjusted to the local time wherever it is they happen to be at the end of a flight like that. But I used a little hack which came from a much earlier episode of Smart Drug Smarts. It was episode, I think, number 36 with Dr. Christopher Winters. So if you listen to that episode, you're going to probably be hearing this again, but that was a couple years ago now, and I figured that this one, especially because it worked well for me, is worth repeating. So here's Dr. Christopher Winters' anti-jet lag hack. About 6 or 8 hours before you get on your flight, stop eating. Stop putting calories into your body. Continue not eating throughout the flight. So you're not going to have any of the airplane food that they offer you along the way, none of the peanuts, none of that stuff. You can have coffee, you can have tea if you want to. Those are acaloric, so your body is still going to be hungry, but that might be a little bit easier than not putting anything other than water into your mouth for however long your flight is. Anyway, when you finally get to the destination, the goal is to start going to bed at night in the new location's time, so you still don't eat until it's about dinner time in the location that you're at. Once dinner happens, you eat a big meal, and then you go to sleep. And here's why it works. Basically, if you think about an animal who is not getting enough food, your body starts thinking, oh, I'm starving to death. That sucks. And our bodies being these very smart things made to keep us alive, if your body thinks that you're starving, it doesn't encourage you to go to sleep. It encourages you to stay awake, so hopefully you will find something to eat. So by doing this traveling fast, you're keeping yourself more awake and alert, basically making it easier to stay awake until what will be bedtime in your new location. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you can't sleep on the plane. I had a long trip, so I definitely got some, crappy airplane sleep on my travels. But I did have nothing but tea for that long period. This is probably 32, 34 hours that I went without food, which is a long time. But after I did the week-long water fast earlier this year, actually, at this point, a day and a half seems like nothing. Again, the hack is just about 6 hours before you get on the flight, stop eating, stay hungry throughout the flight, stay hungry as long as it takes until you get to what will be dinner time in the new location. Have a big old dinner, and then let sleep take you. And hopefully you'll wake up around morning in the new time zone. That's it. And that pretty much got me on California time the day after I got back, which I found to be quite impressive.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
Okay, that is the entire episode number 89, cruising in for a landing. If you liked what you heard, I would heartily encourage you to pick your favorite social media platform and tell some of the other folks there, hey, the Smart Drug Smarts thing is kind of cool. If you've made it all the way to the end of the episode, I'm just taking it on faith that you like us at least a little bit, and every bit of positive word of mouth is super helpful. So thank you. If you happen to be a Twitter person and you want to tweet something about us, slap on the hashtag #StaySmart, and somewhere in the Twitterverse, I will be squealing with joy. I've also joined Instagram recently, which is kind of a fun little platform. I've been trying to take about one photo a day, just, whatever I'm out doing. A lot of them are the pills that I'm popping on a certain day, but sometimes it's just me out and about. So anyway, if you're an Instagram person and you want to check out my goings on, it's instagram.com/smartdrugsmarts, as you might expect. The show notes for this episode will be online at smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to everything that we talked about here. I will be back at you next week at the same time with the same podcast, and of course with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week until then, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.